June 4th, 1943, Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. Una Fizia Vera Burkhart's hand shook as he wrote in his secret diary words that, if his officers found them, would land him in solitary. The Americans must be lying to us. No country could have so much, not while fighting a global war, but the view outside the train window made a joke of everything Nazi propaganda had drilled into him for 3 years. Every farmhouse, every street, every shop blazed with electric light. It was 10 at night, and Texas glittered like a city of stars stretched across the plains. Back in Germany, blackout rules had kept the Reich in darkness since 1940. Even before the war, only about 1 in 5 German farms had electricity. Yet here he was, in the so-called decadent, dying America, watching electricity pour out like it cost nothing. 150 veterans from Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped off the train not from cattle cars or freight wagons, but from Pullman coaches with padded seats, dining cars, and sleeping bunks. The whole town of Mexia showed up just to see them arrive. None of them realized it then, but this was the start of a deep, slow earthquake in the minds of these prisoners, a total demolition of Nazi ideology, not with guns, but with the raw, undeniable proof of American industry. The real story of Allied victory wasn't written in battle plans. It was written in production numbers that would soon smash every certainty these men had about their enemies, their own country, and what they'd been fighting for. The collapse started back on May 13th, 1943 in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement, surrendered along with about 250,000 German and Italian troops. The numbers kept shifting as stragglers gave up over the next few days. These were the Wehrmacht's best desert fighters, the ones who'd chased the British to Egypt and even earned Montgomery's respect. Now they were just prisoners. Among them was Headman Friedrich Radke, Iron Cross First Class, veteran of the campaign in France, twice wounded in North Africa. Years later, historians would find his diary in the National Archives, a goldmine for anyone trying to understand what American captivity did to the German psyche. The trip from defeat to revelation started in Oran, Algeria. Radke and 30,000 other POWs waited in makeshift camps for the ships that would take them across the Atlantic. American efficiency started to crack their old beliefs right away. The U.S. Army processed thousands of prisoners a day with more organization than the Germans had ever managed, even at their peak. Photos for ID cards, medical checks and shots. Their rights under the Geneva Convention, explained by American officers in perfect German. These men had trained for this specifically, but the food, that's where the first real shock hit. Oberleutnant Hans Müller, who'd been captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later in the Oran cage while we waited for the boats, "The Americans fed us better than we'd eaten in 6 months of desert fighting. White bread, real coffee, meat on our plates twice a day. At first, we thought it was a trick, propaganda, something to impress us. We didn't get that this was just their normal army ration. The Liberty ships that carried them across the Atlantic were proof enough of American power all by themselves. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in just over 4 days at a shipyard in Richmond, California. If the Germans had heard that, they would have laughed it off as ridiculous propaganda. But it was true. These ships rolled off the line at a rate of 3 a day when production peaked. On their way back from Europe, instead of returning empty, they carried up to 30,000 POWs a month by summer 1943. That 2-week Atlantic crossing was a masterclass in psychological demolition. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a running account in letters to his family which survived after the war. He noticed that the American crew threw away more food every day than his whole company had gotten in a week during the final months in Africa. Half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that sat out too long, tossed without a second thought, not to show off, just because to them it didn't matter. Their supplies seemed endless. The ships themselves were like floating museums of American power. The prisoners learned that the vessel carrying them was just one of 2,710 Liberty ships built during the war. Every one of them needed 250,000 parts, with components shipped in from 32 different states. The American guards liked to talk, and that's how the prisoners learned about the engines. 3 different factories built those 900 horsepower cylinders, and then they shipped them out to ports that hadn't even existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stauburn, whose Prussian family had fought in every German war since Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs, "As our ship neared the American coast, I watched the radar spinning above the bridge. We'd thought only we, or maybe the British, had this kind of technology. Turns out it's just standard on their cargo ships." That's when it hit him. Germany had already lost. August 2nd, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first look at America smashed whatever Nazi propaganda they still believed about American weakness. Norfolk sprawled over 4,300 acres, its docks stretching for miles, cranes swinging cargo on and off dozens of ships at once. In just one day, that port moved more freight than all of Hamburg did in a week. Gerrit Johann Weber, a factory worker before the war, counted 47 cargo ships at different stages of loading and unloading. In his secret diary, he noted how each crane lifted what would have taken a dozen German workers and horses, except here, they moved silently, powered by electricity, not coal smoke. The prisoners lined up for the march to the trains. Along the way, they passed parking lots packed with civilian cars, hundreds of them, all belonging to dock workers. In Germany, only the rich or party officials owned cars. The Volkswagen, promised since 1934, was still just a dream. Hardly 1,000 had ever reached regular people. Here, ordinary dock workers drove themselves to work. But the real shock came when they saw the trains, not the boxcars or the old 40 and 8 wagons that hauled German soldiers across Europe, but real passenger coaches, Pullman cars with seats that turned into beds, dining cars with white tablecloths and real silverware, observation cars with big windows. Headman Radke wrote, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners. Even the American guards seemed sheepish about the comfort. One sergeant apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working right in their car. Air conditioning in August? Until then, they'd thought only Hitler's personal train had such luxury. That 3-day ride from Norfolk to the camps in Texas and Oklahoma did more to shatter Nazi beliefs than any battlefield defeat. As the train rolled through Virginia, prisoners pressed against the windows. Everywhere, they saw an America that, according to Nazi propaganda, wasn't supposed to exist. Every little town blazed with light. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, places that in Germany might have had one street lamp, showed off shop windows, glowing signs, houses with lights burning in every room. Factories ran all night, parking lots full of cars even at midnight. Oberg writer Mayer, whose father led a Nazi party block back in Hamburg, wrote in a letter found decades later, "We passed through dozens of cities the first night. Everyone had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every American town had power since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged and said, we'd see." In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched American railroad workers do in half an hour what took 2 hours in Germany. Coal loaded by machine, water pumped electrically greasing done by machines. Every bit of it showed off American know-how. But what really unsettled the Germans was the casual wealth of the workers. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles, tossed them away without a thought. They smoked cigarettes constantly, often not even finishing them. Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer before the war, figured that this one rail yard used more electricity in an hour than his whole Berlin district did in a day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote. They left lights on in empty buildings. Electric fans spun in rooms with nobody in them. It was the carelessness of endless resources. By the time the train crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the scale of American industry was impossible to ignore. Through the windows, the prisoners saw factory after factory, each one bigger than anything they'd ever seen back home. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee ran for nearly 2 miles along the river. Its electric furnaces pulled in 175,000 kilowatts more than the whole city of Munich used. Near Louisville, trains slowed as they passed Rubber Town. Synthetic rubber plants had sprung up there, taking over empty fields in just a year and a half. 4 huge factories, each with thousands of workers, churned out 800,000 tons of rubber every year. Germany invented the process, but their best year never topped 120,000 tons. Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, saw what this meant right away. Years later, he remembered, I knew those plants. I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers, each one more advanced than anything we'd built, and there were 4 just in that one spot. They told us there were dozens more all across the country. The train rolled past Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit. You couldn't miss it. It was so big you could see it for miles. They built the place in 9 months. It turned out a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At the height of production, 42,000 workers pieced together bombers from 1,550,000 parts shipped in by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant covered 2.5 million square feet and burned through more electricity than the whole German city of Cologne. Hutman Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed up against the window. He counted 17 B-24s in different stages of assembly right there in plain sight. We'd been told American planes were junk, slapped together, sure to fall apart in combat, he said. But I could see the precision, the quality. These weren't inferior. They were just built faster than we ever thought possible. The deeper the trains went, the more the Nazi myths crumbled. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi on the Eads Bridge. Down below, barges were moving more grain than Germany harvested in all of 1942. Grain elevators lined both banks, each packed with enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Carl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, scribbled in his diary, Americans move food the way we move ammunition. Oceans of it, without a care. I saw them load one barge with enough wheat to feed my whole village for 5 years. The crane operator ate a sandwich with meat thicker than my family's weekly ration. In Kansas City, the train stopped at a giant stockyard. Tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The smell from the meatpacking plants drifted for miles. German POWs, used to surviving on 200 grams of meat per week in Africa, watched as American workers bit into beef sandwiches on lunch break. They ate meat like we ate bread, wrote Paul Fisher. No, that's wrong. They ate meat the way we wish we could eat bread. The guard bought them hamburgers from a stand near the station, meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread, 15 cents each. He bought 20 at once, paid with $1. Nobody thought it was special. This was just their normal food. Then they arrived at the camps. Camp Hearn, Texas, had gone up in just 4 months. It held between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners, most living in better conditions than they'd had as civilians. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, steam heat. Each building used more lumber than some German villages ever saw. The camp hospital floored the German medical staff. Oberst Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical tools, medicine they hadn't seen since 1941, all standard for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer later testified, the miracle drug we'd only heard about. They gave it out freely, even to prisoners with minor infections. Our soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfur drugs, and here the Americans handed us their best medicine without a second thought. The camp kitchen was a lesson in American abundance. Prisoners who worked there found walk-in fridges, electric mixers, automatic dishwashers, and gas ranges big enough to cook for 5,000 men at once. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, foods German civilians hadn't seen together since 1939. Otto Krebs, once a hotel chef in Munich, wrote, "Today, we threw away more food than my family's seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, just extra. American rules say we have to prepare 10% more than needed, so every prisoner gets a full ration. The rest goes in the trash." I cried as I tossed perfectly good bread in the trash. By September 1943, American farms faced such a labor shortage that they started using prisoners of war out in the fields and factories. It wasn't some grand plan, just a move made out of necessity. But honestly, it did more to shake Nazi beliefs than any propaganda ever could. Every day, trucks hauled groups of prisoners out to work. No blindfolds, no secret routes. They saw it all. Mile after mile of corn and wheat. Factories running around the clock. Shops overflowing with goods. Parking lots packed with cars. Houses with fridges and radios in every one. At a cotton gin near Houston, Unwrightsia Herbert Lang watched a single machine churn through more cotton in an hour than his whole village could process in a month. The gin ran on electricity from the Colorado River Authority, a power line that reached 90% of Texas farms by then. And the farmer who owned the place, Lang wrote that he wasn't special. Not rich, not in the party, just a regular farmer. But he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. Even his workers, black laborers, included 8 lunches bigger than what most German workers got in a week. And this wasn't some show. Every farm looked the same. Meanwhile, in Nebraska, prisoners toiled in sugar beet fields and saw machines that left them speechless. One combine did the work of 100 men. The fields stretched on forever. Each was bigger than whole German counties. The farmers bragged about harvests that would have sounded like fairy tales back home. 60 bushels of wheat per acre. In Germany, even the best land barely managed half that. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote from a farm near Scottsbluff. The farmer's son, just 16, drove a tractor worth more than my father earned in his whole life. When Hoffmann mentioned it, the boy just laughed and said the tractor wasn't anything special. His dad was waiting for a new John Deere model that would be even better. But factories delivered the biggest shocks. The Geneva Convention said prisoners couldn't work directly on war production, but they could do jobs that freed Americans for those roles. So thousands of Germans saw American industry up close. At a Campbell's soup plant in New Jersey, they watched machines process more tomatoes in a day than most German factories managed in a month. The place ran with just women and old men. Almost all the young workers were off at war, but they still outproduced peacetime numbers. Stabsfeld Weibel Ernst Wagner, who'd worked in a German food plant before the war, wrote about it. Everything was automated. Conveyor belts, automatic fillers, steam cookers, handling hundreds of cans at once. One old woman watched over the controls. Work that would have needed 50 people in Germany. She did it while sipping coffee and listening to the radio. Near Detroit, prisoners unloaded coal at a power plant and got a look at the auto industry's shift to war production. The River Rouge complex loomed across the water. 100,000 workers building jeeps, engines, tanks. The place burned through 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity every day, more than the whole city of Hamburg. Obergefreiter Franz Kellner wrote, "We could see the parking lots, thousands of cars, just for the workers. In Germany, even our officers hardly owned cars. Here, ordinary workers drove to work. The guard told us some folks had 2 cars, one for work, one for family." We thought he was joking. By the winter of 1943, all this started to hit home. American intelligence officers called it ideological collapse syndrome. The Special Projects Division, a secret re-education effort, noticed more prisoners asking for American books, newspapers, and classes. In December, Major Paul Noland reported, "The prisoners don't argue when we show them production stats. They've seen enough. Even the most diehard Nazis have gone quiet. They still say they're loyal to Germany, but no one talks about victory anymore." Now, many openly question what they were told about America. Even the camp newspapers, written by the prisoners, started to change. The paper at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, shifted from chest-thumping nationalism to articles about democracy, economics, and what life after the war might look like. The editors, handpicked anti-Nazi prisoners, saw the other POWs grow more open-minded by the day. Lieutenant Herman Gutz, who'd been captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote home in a letter that slipped past American censors. "They told us America was a weak, divided mongrel nation run by Jews, no good at war. Every day here, I see the truth. This place is the most organized, united, and powerful country on earth. We were fed fairy tales by criminals, but the real hammer blow to Nazi beliefs didn't come from lectures. It came from how Americans treated the Italian prisoners after Italy surrendered in September 1943. Italians who agreed to help the Allies got better rooms, more money, and real freedom. Germans watched their old allies working freely, with Americans eating in restaurants, even dating local women. Feldman Friedrich Schultz wrote, "The Italians betrayed us, but Americans treat them better than we ever did as allies. They work freely, earn wages, send gifts home. The Americans show them no hate. This democracy we learned to despise feels more honorable than our own system." Then came Christmas 1943, and the effect was almost overwhelming. American groups, churches, clubs, you name it, sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German POWs. A few months earlier, these same men had been shooting at American soldiers. Each box was stuffed with cigarettes, candy, toiletries, games. Local folks invited POWs to Christmas dinners, though most weren't allowed to go. At Camp Hearn in Texas, the Methodist Church choir sang carols in German. Local women baked cookies and cakes. Boy Scouts handed out homemade Christmas cards. This flood of kindness rocked the last pieces of Nazi racial theory. Oberleutnant Walter Meller, whose brother had died in Hamburg, wrote, "They know we're the enemy. Many have sons or husbands fighting our armies, but they treat us with real Christian charity. No propaganda, just genuine goodwill." Who does that for their enemies? Only people absolutely sure of victory, secure in their power. The Christmas feast itself was almost unreal. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, even ice cream. More food than Germany had seen since before World War I. The prisoners ate until they felt sick, stunned. that so much could be given to enemies. We ate like kings, Feldwebel Hansa wrote, better than German generals or party leaders ever eat. And this isn't special. The guards say this is just a normal American Christmas dinner. Every family eats like this. If they feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat? By early 1944, over 40,000 German POWs were taking classes. They studied English, American history, math, science. The University of Chicago sent them correspondence courses. Stanford professors came out to teach about democracy and economics. The hunger for knowledge was endless. These prisoners had grown up hearing Americans were uncultured brutes, but now they found libraries crammed with books, colleges open to anybody, research leading the world. They read American newspapers, compared opinions, something unthinkable in Nazi Germany. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist drafted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, sat in on atomic physics lectures at Camp Shelby. He wrote later, American professors, even Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without bitterness. They said science belongs to everyone. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared everything, even with enemies. That kind of generosity was unthinkable under the Nazis. The camp's theaters didn't show propaganda, just straight-up Hollywood movies. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, saw Americans dealing with defeat and bouncing back, an experience that hit close to home. They saw The Grapes of Wrath and couldn't believe Americans would show their own flaws and failures to their enemies. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer wrote, they hide nothing. They show their troubles, their mistakes, their conflicts, but it makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, criticism like that means death. Here, it's considered patriotic. By spring 1944, prisoner labor programs grew as America's production machine hit top speed. German POWs worked in canneries, mills, factories, seeing American industrial might up close. The numbers spoke for themselves. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel that would become the landing craft for D-Day. They watched workers build 700 boats every month, each one needing 20,000 parts. No propaganda could compete with that. The factory ran day and night with 20,000 workers, thousands of them women. They drove cranes, welded steel hulls, kept the production lines moving. Stabsfeld, Wiebel, Kurt. Zimmerman watched and wrote, women doing men's work, black workers running complicated machines, teenagers at the drills. Everything they told us was impossible in a democracy, but the work never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They made more boats in a month than our Navy built in a year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners stared as 10,000 tons of steel poured out every day. The blast furnaces never cooled, always hungry for the ore trains from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale was just wild, one plant making more steel than the whole Ruhr at its peak. OBW writer Paul Hartman remembered, I worked at Crook before the war. I thought I knew industry, but this was another universe. They spilled more steel than we could produce. Workers grumbled about overtime, but the output? We couldn't match it, even with slave labor and double shifts. And then came the harvest of 1944, finally shattering Nazi claims about American weakness. German prisoners scattered across the Midwest, working in fields and watching farms that could feed a continent. In Kansas, they saw wheat fields where a single farm outproduced whole German provinces. Combines rolled across the plains, harvesting 100 acres a day. The elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in a year. A farmer from East Prussia, Unteroffizier Franz Weber, wrote, One American with a machine does the work of 100 Germans. They showed me aerial photos, endless grain. They could lose half their crop and still have more than all of Europe. Out in California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that seemed to go on forever. They watched as perfectly good fruit was dumped for tiny flaws, fruit that would have been precious back home. Sometimes whole crops were destroyed just to keep prices steady. Prisoners from starving Germany couldn't believe it. Gerhard Otto Schultz wrote, "They crushed mountains of oranges because they had too many. We begged to send them home to our families, but the guards just shook their heads. The waste was a message, we have more than enough." Then June 6th, 1944 arrived. Normandy. When prisoners heard the news, that was it. The last shreds of Nazi confidence just fell away. The numbers were staggering. 6,000 ships, 11,000 planes, 150,000 men in the first wave. American organization on a level they'd never imagined. At Camp Shelby, prisoners watched newsreels, saw the endless convoys, the prefabricated harbors, the supply lines pushing 15,000 tons onto open beaches every day. They watched their own country crumbling under the weight of the very nation they'd been told was too soft to fight. Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "We knew then it was all lost, not just the war, but the whole Nazi dream. We'd challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and race myths. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatics, courage against their bottomless resources. But the thing that shook them most wasn't the machines or the food. It was how Americans treated them. Nazi propaganda always called Americans weak, sentimental, but prisoners found a people confident enough to show mercy. When Gerrit Hans Miller's son died in the Hamburg bombings, the American camp commander himself delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she couldn't feed their kids, American church groups sent food to her in Germany, enemy civilians in a war. Headman Otto wrote, "They told us they fought Hitler, not Germans. I thought it was propaganda, but it turned out to be true. They wanted us to rebuild Germany, not destroy it." Medical care hit hard too. German doctors worked with Americans, learning new techniques and using advanced equipment. Prisoners got surgeries that only the rich could have back home. They even treated mental health, something almost unheard of in the Wehrmacht. Dr. Friedrich Bauer noticed prisoners who tried suicide got counseling, not punishment. Those with breakdowns got therapy, not beatings. Seeing kindness shown to enemies, we realized a strength we'd never understood before, the quiet confidence that comes with real power. By March 1945, that secret re-education program had changed everything. More than 25,000 prisoners signed up for democracy courses. Camp newspapers started running articles on constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. People gathered in discussion groups, arguing about the future of Germany. The results blew everyone away. Prisoners who'd arrived as die-hard Nazis were now writing essays on rebuilding Germany as a democracy. Officers who once pledged loyalty to Hitler were plotting how to bring American farming techniques back home. "We turned into missionaries for democracy," admitted Ust Hermann Göring in 1975, no relation to the Reich Marshal. "Not because anyone forced us or thanks to slick propaganda. We just saw it happen. We watched regular folks living better than German aristocrats ever had. We wanted that for ourselves." The change ran so deep that American officials actually started to worry. Prisoners grew almost too eager about American ways. Some asked to stay in the U.S. after the war. Others married American women they met through prison pen pal programs. By the 1950s, thousands of these former prisoners ended up immigrating to America. Then April 1945 brought the last shock. As US troops liberated German concentration camps, they showed the footage to POWs. At first, many didn't believe it. They called it propaganda. But the evidence just kept piling up. Stories from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and finally, letters from home confirming the horror. The psychological blow was crushing. Men who'd clung to some shred of German honor, even after defeat, now saw the full moral collapse of their country. What they'd fought for wasn't just lost. It was evil. Headman Walter Schmidt put it best. We thought we were warriors for a great cause. Turns out we were just tools for criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior people, but we were the real barbarians. The Americans we used to call weak and decadent, well, they showed us what civilization really means. By May 1945, when the war ended, German POWs got ready to go home with mixed feelings. They'd seen an America that flipped everything they'd believed upside down. As prisoners, they ate better than they had as soldiers. The enemy treated them with more respect than their own leaders ever had. Their last months in captivity were all about preparing for the wreckage back home. Americans gave them vocational training, lessons in agriculture, and political education. They knew about the Marshall Plan before it was public, saw that America planned to help rebuild, not just punish. They prepared us to rebuild our country, wrote Ost Friedrich von Tobin. They gave us skills, knowledge, hope. They turned defeated soldiers into future citizens for men raised on Nazi revenge. This generosity was almost impossible to grasp. Between 1945 and 1946, over 370,000 German POWs left American camps and returned to a country torn apart and destitute. But they brought back something precious, an inside look at how a free, democratic society actually works. They'd seen American prosperity, industry, and democracy up close. They knew rebuilding was possible because they'd seen it with their own eyes. Some of these former POWs shaped West Germany's future. Hans Kroll, once held at Camp Shelby, became West Germany's ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Co., ended up president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Mar from Camp Herne became Germany's permanent representative to the UN. Edward Ackermann, who spent time at Fort Robinson, led German agricultural reform. They brought American methods into German industry, American efficiency to German farms, and American democratic ideals into politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s owed a lot to what they'd learned in those camps. We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, Hans Kroll wrote later. We saw democracy build wealth, diversity create strength, and treating workers well boost production. These lessons, picked up as prisoners, helped shape the new Germany. Historians call the German POW experience in America one of the most successful re-education programs ever. There was no force, no classic propaganda, just the daily reality of American democracy and industry quietly turning hardened Nazis into future democratic citizens. The whole thing worked because people didn't just hear about a better way. They saw it for themselves. German prisoners in America saw something they never expected. A country running at full speed, treating even its enemies with real dignity. They watched American factories crank out goods in a way that made Germany's own industry look old-fashioned. Everyday life here. Electric lights, hot meals, working toilets, laid bare just how empty the Nazi promises really were. Dr. Arnold Kramer, who's basically the authority on German POWs in America, summed it up best. America won the propaganda war not through clever messages, but through sheer reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The POWs were converted by prosperity, and the numbers back him up. Out of 371,683 German POWs held in America, less than 1% even tried to escape. Just 2,222 attempts in total. After the war, 95% of them said their treatment was good or excellent. Thousands kept in touch with American families for decades. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, over 500 former prisoners came back to America for a reunion in Austin, Texas, bringing their families along to see where their lives had changed. Hans Weyer, once an Oberritter at Fort Robinson in Nebraska, returned to the U.S. after the war and became a doctor in Maine. At the reunion, he spoke about life in the camps. For many of us who grew up in cold water flats in Germany, this was a huge step up. We found running water, central heating, and more food than we'd ever seen. But above all, we discovered dignity. Kurt Meir, a former Stabsfeldwebel who worked on Iowa farms, remembered the kindness he found there. The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, sometimes even their homes. That kind of humanity from people whose sons were fighting against us changed us for good. The keynote speaker that night, 78-year-old Herman Gutz, nailed it. We came to America as enemies, Nazis, believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes from production, not conquest, from diversity, not hatred, from freedom, not tyranny. We saw the arsenal of democracy in action. We saw farmers feeding the world, workers building the tools of victory, and citizens treating their enemies with dignity. America's real weapon wasn't its bombs or tanks, it was its endless ability to create and its unshakable confidence. We went back to Germany determined to help build a society that could thrive in peace, not war. Gutz finished with a simple thanks. We came as conquerors but left as students. To America from your former enemies, now your friends, thank you for showing us the way. The whole place stood up and cheered. Americans and Germans together, celebrating a transformation nobody would have believed possible back when those first trains rolled into Texas in 1943. The scale of the German POW experience in America is best told through the numbers. Over 500 camps spread across 45 states, everywhere except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. There were 175 main camps and 325 branch camps, each built to hold anywhere from 250 to 12,000 prisoners. Construction crews finished a camp in about 90 days. At its peak in May 1945, there were 371,683 German POWs out of a total of 871 Axis prisoners in the U.S. New arrivals came in waves, $20,000 a month in 1943, $30,000 a month after D-Day, and $60,000 a month in the war's final stretch. These men weren't just sitting around either. They put in 14 million days of agricultural labor and processed 100 million board feet of lumber, $230 million worth of work by 1940 standards, earning 80 cents a day. They filled vital labor gaps in 46 states. As for escapes, out of over 371,000 prisoners, just 2,222 tried to break out, about 0.6%. None ever pulled off a permanent escape. Most were caught within 24 hours and no American civilians were ever hurt. Education mattered too. More than 40,000 POWs signed up for classes. There were 135 camp newspapers, 30,000 men taking English lessons, 15,000 in vocational training, and 8,000 doing university correspondence courses. After the war, about 5,000 former POWs immigrated to the U.S. More than 12,000 kept writing to American families. some for an average of 31 years. Many came back as tourists or business partners. When asked, 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Three-quarters said captivity changed their worldview for the better. 61% wanted to learn about democracy. By 1945, fewer than 10% still held strong Nazi beliefs. Those German POWs didn't just watch history happen. America's reality changed them right down to the core. Captivity turned into education for them. Defeat brought enlightenment. Being locked up set them free from the grip of Nazi ideology. In the end, America's biggest win wasn't on any battlefield. It happened in the prison camps where the sheer reality of life in a democracy did what bullets and bombs couldn't. It changed the way these men thought. When the German POWs first arrived, they believed in their own superiority and expected to find America weak. What they found was something else entirely. American industry didn't just outmatch what they knew, it blew their minds. These men came from a world of shortages and fear. Suddenly, they saw factories that never stopped, shelves that were always full, a society that just worked. In 1943, trains brought them to America as soldiers of the Third Reich. By 1946, ships took them home as something different, people who had seen a better way. They went back not just with memories of defeat, but with a clear picture of what freedom and democracy could actually do. They had seen the future up close, and it worked. Their story proves something important. America's real strength wasn't just in tanks, planes, or endless production lines. It was in showing, not just telling, what a free society could make possible. Abundance, opportunity, dignity. The German POWs didn't just lose a war. They gained a new understanding. They saw for themselves that prosperity doesn't come from conquering others or clinging to racist myths. It comes from freedom and working together. These men came to America thinking they'd find a country on the ropes. Instead, they found a giant, powerful, yes, but also open-hearted in ways they hadn't expected. They arrived as prisoners, but they left as witnesses to what democracy could achieve. Their awe at America's abundance planted the first seeds of post-war partnership, the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and Germany's own democratic rebirth. When they returned, the old world they'd known was gone. Their children would grow up in a new Germany, democratic, allied with the United States, part of a different future. And it all started when a group of Afrika Korps veterans got off a train in Texas and realized almost everything they believed was wrong. In the end, the story of the German POWs in America is about redemption through revelation. It shows that the greatest victories sometimes come not from smashing your enemies, but from showing them a better way. These former soldiers became accidental ambassadors for democracy, bringing home the seeds of transformation that would change Germany forever. Their journey from Nazi soldiers to citizens of a free country is one of the most remarkable turnarounds in modern history. It didn't happen through force or propaganda, but through living proof of what free people can build together. That was America's real secret weapon, not just churning out more war machines, but turning former enemies into friends just by letting them witness what freedom could do. The German POWs were stunned by what they saw, but more importantly, they were changed by it. And in that change, the world found hope for something better.